of the reactions we are not even aware of, we have not seen. So therefore, very little that we can predict as far as the corona is concerned. Now in 21st century, I'm a student of disaster like Dr. Sunita Reddy is. And if you look into the last 120 years of disasters that we have seen on this earth, then there were two disasters which actually used to kill people in large numbers before World War II. And these, these two disasters, there's some disturbance going on.
Yeah, I have to mute. Let me see.
These, okay, I'll continue, but
Yeah, yes, sir.
these two disasters were famine and epidemics, and they would kill people in thousands and thousands. But after World War II, a great change took place that less people started dying of epidemics and famines. Less people. And of course, you all know of the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed, like millions of people. In India also, it created havoc. But these things became very rarity. In 21st century, corona or COVID-19 is the fourth epidemic that we are seeing. And the three epidemics that we saw before it were again limited to geographical areas. First one was SARS, of course. We had 2003 SARS we had. Then we had Zika and Ebola. So these are the epidemics that we had, and we were able to contain them, and of course we were able to create situations for their containment. And now this corona, which has come to us as a very, very new thing, I would say new thing that we are going to adjust to. Of course, we will adjust eventually we'll adjust, but something new that has come. And therefore, I'll try to discuss with some of the medical anthropological knowledge also, which can be relevant to this as well. But then before that, I would like to start with, uh, you know, epidemiological issues involved. And from a vintage anthropological point of view, I would look at it. Are there patterns in the prevalence of COVID-19? Let us try to see that. And of course, I have my own hypothesis, and I would like to call it as, I don't know whether you accept it or not, I would like to call it as aviational etiology. And the hypothesis that I'm going to put forth is per capita international travel is directly proportional to COVID-19 prevalence. We actually see a clear-cut divide between countries which were making international travels and countries which were not making so many international travels. Of course, countries making international travels and then the kind of governance issues that were there in order to contain corona, and all these multiple factors have played a role in prevalence of COVID-19 in particular countries. But international travel has some kind of, to my mind, direct linkage with it. Secondly, I see that prevalence of COVID-19 is directly proportional to economic development. And we do see, again, some kind of a divide between economically developed countries and not so developed countries. Economically developed countries are showing higher prevalence of COVID-19, and not so developed countries, you look into Latin America, except for Brazil, which were actually, there was some governance issues there. You look into Africa and you look to Southeast Asia, you would see that there is some kind of a clear-cut economic divide that we can see. Then rich and developed countries, rich and developed regions, metro cities, in comparison to rural areas, are showing higher prevalence of COVID-19. Now, so rich people have been clinically impacted more by COVID-19, and poor people have been economically impacted more by COVID-19. So economic disasters are more with the poor people and clinical disasters are more with the rich people. This is what I'm saying. Now in India, now looking at India is very interesting thing that is emerging. Like again, these are all hypotheses and I don't know. I may be wrong. I may also be wrong because this is a presumption that I have. Long back, I saw a documentary in which, there were two people who traveled to Indian highways. One person traveled in the western highways, that is from Gujarat to Maharashtra to Karnataka and down below. Other person started from UP and from UP to Bihar and to Odisha and like that. So one took eastern highways for looking at India, another took western highways to look at India. This is a documentary that I saw. I don't remember the name of this documentary. But what they were able to tell us that these western highways were highly advanced with all kinds of modern facilities, very good roads. And in comparison, the eastern highways, they were not so good. They were not so advanced, and there were not many amenities that were available when people were traveling there. Now, when you look at now India's map, if you look at India's map, along you see a clear-cut difference between the eastern and the western side. You have all the red zones on the most of the red zones on the western side. Look at Bihar, look at Jharkhand, look at uh, Chhattisgarh, even Odisha. If you look into it, so you see that kind of an economic division that I was telling you about the rich countries and poor countries. But in India also, the rich regions and the poor regions, you are having, there is a clear-cut difference between rich regions. Poor regions are more to our greener side, rich regions are more to our red side. And that can be clearly seen in the Indian. Now, what is the critical point that differentiate these two regions? I think again, this international travel is an important factor that I think has to give some explanation to why this kind of a difference that we are seeing. Now, another important, I think, significant point that emerges out of this COVID-19 situation, for the first time, I think the power of use and misuse of social media, WhatsApp, and in order to create, in order to spread information, but at the same time, in order to spread misinformation. Both ways, we have seen that social media has played an important role. Now, this social media, we have been noticing as anthropologists that was playing a very important role in, especially in our fieldwork. Now, the students who are from anthropology would know that for the last 3 years, whenever we are going for fieldwork to some communities, somebody will send a WhatsApp message that some Chinese have come here because some of the students are from Northeast and they are injecting virus to people. These kind of things were spread. So we have been seeing that it was becoming very difficult to conduct anthropological fieldwork in. So that is how the WhatsApp or social media was entering into anthropological, traditional anthropological fieldwork. And we have seen that in this situation of COVID-19, the social media has played a very, very important role. Now, I would like to come to medical anthropology. What can medical anthropology contribute? In 2001, when this earthquake, huge earthquake took place, I accompanied a ICMR team, which was basically a team consisting of psychiatrists and psychiatric social workers and clinical psychologists. And I was a lone anthropologist there. And I landed there with this team immediately 1 week after that earthquake has taken place. And I was wondering, what can I do here? What could be my role? Because people were, we were in the stage of response and people wanted some kind of medicines and all those things. What can anthropologists do? So it is really, in the field of disasters and particularly in the field of pandemics, what can be the role of anthropologists? This is a very, very important question. Now, before I answer that question, what anthropologists can do or what medical anthropologists particularly can do, I would like to actually quote a definition of medical anthropology that I gave. And I think it is important for me to quote this definition here. With your permission, this definition I gave appeared in Eastern Anthropologist issue of 2016. It was 69 volume and number 1. And I read this definition. And I defined medical anthropology investigates the issues related to health, illness, and disease from socio-cultural, biocultural, eco-cultural, and politico-economic perspective. It further strives to achieve an empowering, equitable, and patient-oriented healthcare which is accessible, affordable, besides conforming to patients' expectations. Now, from this definition, two things which are very, very important, which are emerging very, very important, I think, which have some bearing for COVID-19 pandemic. First, medical anthropological perspective is a holistic perspective. And as a holistic perspective, we are not looking merely at the clinical side of it. We are not merely looking at the public health side of it. We are looking at it from all angles, from social, cultural, economic, political, economic, from all angles we try to look at. So when we are trying to see what is happening, we are having a holistic perspective. And second, our perspective is more rooted towards people's perception, towards the emic, what people need, what people want. And that is where I think medical anthropology is critically different. Now, so medical anthropology's holistic perspective, it can investigate social, cultural, economic, and political impact on the communities. And in order to investigate these impacts that they are having, use of qualitative and participatory methods can better inform needed actions. And I think I'll be talking about, we have made some blunders because we have not cared to understand what people are thinking. Because, generally speaking, especially the people in the power, people who take decisions, they sometimes think people are ignorant, people are fools, people don't know, whereas people always are very rational. We have to understand why they are doing what they are doing and what is the rationality. Unless we understand that rationality behind people's action, I don't think we can really communicate to them. This is very important. Secondly, medical anthropology can definitely contribute to pandemic prevention, especially by designing effective communication. And effective communication, it should be in the language of the people, and use of the metaphor that the people are familiar with, so that the message reaches them. And I tell you, once people understand what is required, once they have the knowledge, the real knowledge with them, Indians are highly innovative. Indians are always very innovative. We generally do not trust their intelligence. People who are not very educated, who are living in the village, can really invent new things, can innovate, unless if we provide them the right information. So right information is not reading. Then I think community mobilization and citizen engagement. This is something which medical anthropology contribute very, very, I think, effectively. Now, let us talk about medical anthropological perspective that was used in Ebola work in West Africa, and which was not very long. In Ebola work, of course, medical anthropological contribution was not much. Out of $10 billion that were used in research for Ebola, I think medical anthropologists spent around 3 million, which came to 0.03% of the total grant. So they had not, but I think they they came out with very critical knowledge, and that knowledge that was generated during Ebola pandemic in Africa recently in 2016, I think can be important. I have noted down some of it. Anthropological recommendations were: first one, build relationship with people. Now, more you build relations with people, more you will be able to effectively face the curve. Second, attend to cultural norms. I think this is something which was a very critical lesson that came out of that. Attend to cultural norms. Give respect and deference to traditional leaders and informal social and political systems, which generally we go and we restrict ourselves to maybe formal sector. but informal is important. Then support and do not harm local and regional social and economic networks. I think this is also very critical. Then work with rather than against local populations. Now, please listen to their conclusions and how important these conclusions are for India today. If people are disregarding health communication messages, the problem may well lie with the message and the messenger, not with the audience. So thinking that audience are to be blamed is a very wrong way of looking at things. Now, let us come to why people do not behave on expected lines. What is happening is that in India right now, we are, I would say that in order to, control pandemic of COVID-19, we are actually using a war model. It's a war model that we are using. I remember, when our Prime Minister for the first time addressed the nation, he remembered the war situation when people used to, there is to be siren, siren, playing of siren, people would hide themselves. And, that is the kind of, I think, memory that he started with. And we are having a war model of, which is of course perfectly fine, because we are fighting with a virus that is so invisible to us, and therefore utmost discipline is required. But then war model and democracy, there is a very thin line that differentiates. And this is very important because people get angry. Now, why people do not behave on the expected line? Now, it has to do with, I think, there are some historical, there are some historical regions of a country. There are some old memories that people have. People own, their own perception about government. They have their own perception about whether to trust a government. And it is a combination. It's a very, very complex, very, very complex situation that makes people take a decision to whether they should accept or they should not accept what is being instructed to them. And then we have cause of fear and suspicion. There is something called fear that is there, fear of unknown. Now, this fear of unknown leads to suspicion, and this is quite natural because people are they become suspicious because they want, that is a defense mechanism. So whenever there is a fear, then you suspect things. It is a very natural and normal behavior. It is a defense mechanism. You want to protect yourself. Now look at, like in India, after the lockdown was announced, people started taking a journey of 2,000 kilometers, 3,000 kilometers, 1,400 kilometers on foot, many of them. You see why they were doing that? This is a very, very strange behavior that we saw. Why people do such kind of things? They do because they were under fear. And under fear, they were doing that as a defense because they thought that they would be alive only when they are able to reach among their own people. So then, we have all kinds of behavioral issues with respect to the quarantine. Now, a little bit about quarantine. This is a new term. Well, as medical anthropologists or as disaster experts, quarantine is a very, very popular term. But I think quarantine has now become the most popular term. What is quarantine? Quarantine, actually, the term came in 1370 when there was this plague epidemic in Venice in Europe. And quarantine actually means 40 days. 40 days of containment. The ships that were, docking at the port, they were contained for 40 days. And that 40 means quarantine. Now, quarantine later on became a kind of a strategy to isolate, to contain people so that infection is not spread from them to others. And I think this is a very, very time-tested strategy to contain epidemics in the past. Now, what we are seeing in India, there are all kinds of social problems which are emerging. Of course, there are two things that I would like to highlight here. One is, I would say that even social media is to be blamed in this. The social cleavages are becoming deeper, which is not good. Generally speaking, when you have fear, people come together, people come near. We have seen in the situation of disasters, people help each other. But the same should have happened with COVID-19, which is also a disaster. People should have come closer, people should have come near, people should have helped. People are helping in great many. But this social media, this WhatsApp and all these kind of things that are happening, they are also trying to create social cleavages along regional lines, along religious lines, and all those things, which is again a very, very dangerous thing that is happening. Now, we come to another problem that is coming because again of fear of unknown. People indulge in ostracizing. They ostracize. This is a kind of a very age-old cultural strategy to ostracize. You remember in villages, whenever people used to have leprosy, they would be isolated and thrown into some, so that people, that is again out of fear. A similar fear is there as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Now people are, you know, coming in the way of burials and cremations. And this is not only happening in India, it is happening in many places that people are not given place for burying the dead. People are not given place for cremation. I think these are very, very, strange situations. And here, I think communication has to play a very, very important role. Ostracizing, in many, many places we see, even in educated urban people, they try to stay away from people who are fighting for, people who are doctors, people who are nurses. So these are again challenges, and these challenges are, I think, social challenges. These are medical anthropological challenges. These are public health challenges, where an effective message has to go to people so that these things does not happen. Now, what is happening? What are the kind of pandemic containment strategies that we see here? So we see, of course, quarantine. I told you about quarantine is one. Then preventive communication that we are having, contact tracing, social distancing, and stranded population. This is what we see here. Now, I think there are some critical behavior needing change, and this is an important area where I think medical anthropology and social scientists have to play a very important role to initiate or to suggest strategies for behavior change, communication, critical behavior change. Now, personal hygiene, I like to start by personal hygiene. I think personal hygiene is something that was not very, very popular in India. And this is a habit that we have to, acquire as far as the corona is concerned. But this is a habit which I think is going to go a long way in saving Indian population from gastrointestinal problems that are too endemic to us. So washing of hand, then touching of face, there are, of course, this is a behavior, because face is a very critical area as far as the COVID-19 is concerned. In the face, you have this, what is called as T-zone. Now, this T-zone is very critical. And we have been asking for you wearing masks so that you don't touch your T-zone. Now, why do Indians touch their face? Now, we touch our face. I would say there are three regions. One is unconscious. We just touch our face. We unconsciously touch our face. But secondly, is that we may feel itching, real, or we may feel like that, and we try to scratch some part of our face. This is the second reasons for touching the face. And third is again a subconscious action where we try to indulge in self-cleaning. We think there is something in the eyes, or we try to trace it out, or something here, something there. So these are the three important uh, behaviors where the hand touches the face. And I think preventing hand touching the face is a very, very important strategy, behavior change that should occur with coronavirus. Now, how should we change that behavior? How should we make sure that our hand is not touching our face? Now, I see somebody was touching his nose like this. So this is a very, very common behavior that we see. So how to make sure? Now, of course, one of the very simple way is you put a mask here, and even if you're touching your face, and then you're touching the mask and not the face. But then can we make it a part of habit that we don't touch our face and we wash our hands as a habit? I think that would be a very uh, then spitting behavior. Now, spitting behavior, I have been doing researches for many years, and spitting is a very common thing that Indians do now. I think because they are not allowed to go out, spitting and urinating in the public is a very common, I think, Indian behavior that is again very much critically related to COVID-19, which again need to be changed, because after some time the lockdown will be over and then we will be outside, and there spitting is again, which is again sometimes we do is just like that, just like we try to like to spit, we can hold it, but we spit it because it's part of our habit. Then we have public coughing. This is something which generally people are doing, or maybe this is again a behavior that needs to be again changed. There has to be some social science strategies needed. And finally, I think personal distancing or social space. I think we as Indians, we have a social space and we come very close to other person, and to the extent of intruding into their own personal space. Because I was talking to a Japanese once, and she told me that people try to come very close, which makes her very uncomfortable. Now, Indians have a different concept of social space, and our social space is we don't keep a difference of 1 foot or 2 foot, but we go very close to other person. I think there also we need to change our habits. Now, so, what are the medical anthropological challenges that we have? And I'll finish it, I think, in another 5 minutes. So, I think there are many medical anthropological challenges that we have, and I have more questions. We see that people have mostly behaved on predictable lines, but again, they have been unpredictable. We have not been able to foresee when would people congregate together, when would people crowd together. We have seen that happening in Surat, we have seen that happening in Bandra, we have seen that happening in the borders of Delhi, and in many places in India. This is very common. So this is very critical as far as prevention or containment of COVID-19 is concerned. So this is a challenge. And again, uh, well, can we this war model that is there to containment, we have to think about what are the limitations of war model, and whether this war model is correct, whether what has happened is, again, I like to uh, you know in the context of disaster management, we say that people should not be treated as victims, but they should be treated as active survivors. So what has happened so far? We have got a huge population of migrant laborers which is stranded in different places. And they are very capable people. They have been contained and they have been seen as passive victims. Actually, they should be seen as active survivors wherever they are. Even if we are putting them into places, they would have been happier. Because I remember in I think in Rajasthan, there were these migrant laborers in a school. They were put up in a school, and they requested villagers to provide them with the paints and the things, and they painted the school. So that is a good example of treating people not as victims of the circumstances, but as active survivors and making use of their resources, their human resources. I think that is important. And of course, while while taking actions as far as the lockdown is concerned, we know that there have been some misjudgments, especially about crowding of the people. But I think these were very, as I said, these were very unprecedented situations, and these were very desperate situations. And I think as a country, we have been doing fairly well. But I think what has happened is that we have to pay a very heavy economic price, and I think we have to pay a very heavy, I think, I would say, price in the governance as well. And this is what I personally see. Finally, like I would like to link uh, COVID-19 with, I think, uh, sustainable development goals, and particularly, you know, two goals I would like to highlight here. SDG goal number 6 is clean water and sanitation. And I think everywhere this particular goal, we see some kind of a positive thing happening, because water of Yamuna, water of Ganges, water of other rivers everywhere, because of the human activities, are almost come to standstill. The rivers have the power to rejuvenate themselves, and they are coming. That we can see. People are seeing, reporting, reporting these dolphins in the Ganges, and these are all people never imagined. And then second, I think SDG goal number 13, climate action. Climate action is also something which we have to see as a positive of of COVID-19. The air pollution, the noise pollution, the all those kind of climatic actions that were there. We see, like right now, we are into, otherwise in other years, Delhi would have been burning, but it's not burning so much. And I think this is so. Then I think two more points that I would like to make here before I end. We have to see the positives of corona as well. Accidental deaths, I think there is a drastic decline all over the world in the accidental. There are no train accidents, there are no aviation accidents, and there are very rare road accidents. I think more people than those who have died of corona have been saved because of no accidents. So we have to see corona. Corona has come as a reminder. I would say it has come as a reminder to the humanity to pause and to think which direction we need to go. And I would like to end by saying that Earth, in the whole Brahmand or in the whole cosmos, Earth is like a very, very tiny thing. It's like a microscopic entity in comparison to the whole Brahmand. And the coronavirus is again a microscopic entity in comparison to Earth. But look at what it has done. A very, very invisible virus, invisible creature has made us think, made us rethink about which direction we are going, what kind of fossil fuel we are living with, what kind of society we are living. And I think I would say that there is going to be post-corona world again. The world is again going to get into new order, like we had a new world order after World War II. There is definitely going to be the new world order after corona. It will be called as post-corona world. And post-corona world, I think in post-corona world, many of the institutions are going to be readjusted. Many of the social norms or countries' norms or rules are going to change. I think the very power balance in the world is going to change now. And those who are very mighty, powerful may not become that much powerful. This all happens. So this is what my expectations. I'm really grateful to all of you for patiently listening to me, and to Sunita ji for giving me this opportunity. If there are any questions, I would be very glad to address them. please remember that I'm not able to, sitting. I'm not used to sitting in a kind of cyber place or virtual place. So take care of that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. There are a few questions. I think I'll moderate the questions,
Yes,
Sangamitra,
sure. Very good.
and then Sangamitra can wind up with her comments. I also welcome all the students and faculty across India. I'm so glad to see people from Northeast, North India, even South. Many of them have joined, so almost 100 of them. I would like to welcome Professor Shiva Prasad, and he has very important two pertinent questions for you, Professor Joshi. I would like to ask Professor Shiv Prasad to raise the same questions so that he can address.
Yeah, I just, it's a good, interesting lecture or talk. My point is, it is actually the way environment and the resources are destroyed. Don't you think it is that impact? Because the countries where the resources are plundered, making wealth out of that, they are the ones who suffered more, not the countries where the resources are still intact largely. This is one question. Second question is the migrant population who have tried to go back. It is, I don't think it is out of fear. It is out of feeling of insecurity and starvation. So therefore, it is nothing to do with, because they are facing corona all through the life, because the survival itself is that. They don't have food, they don't have anything, and their future is always uncertain. So they are not scared of corona. They are scared of the people in the name of corona who swallow them. So this is one thing. That migration, the large scale migration, it is not something unexpected. It is something expected because there is no protection for them. There is no guarantee. And they don't know what is their future. This is the kind of, because the whole way in which it is organized, I feel that it is absolutely bad management, bad governance. So that is what is happening. And all other behavioral aspects, I think they're varying. It may have impact, it may not have impact. There are people who will survive, and there are people who are not even affected in spite of all this, because they're what we call not that they're partly resistant to that. So there are variations, human variations exist. So we must accept, even I think from the medical anthropological perspective, we accept that not only behavioral, but even the human body's reactions. So I just wanted you to react on these things.
Okay, Dr. Shiva, I think I take your point, and like you said, there is no fear. Of course, I told you that there is also something called the social memory.
Yes.
Social memory is very important, and then the history, and that trust that they have. After all, everybody is saying, don't worry, we'll provide you food, Everyone is saying that. No, you don't have to worry, we'll do that, we'll do that. Well, why do people then decided? They decided because they were afraid. They said that I don't think we are going to get anything. Even if we have to die, we better die in our home, And that's why I think people started walking. People started walking.
But they were not getting.
Yeah.
Getting.
Of course, now they are, but they have suffered a lot. Now, about your first point, that is about plundering of resources and all those things. I think, again, this is your hypothesis. Like yes. I have my own aviation hypothesis. I don't know, I don't know. So let these be a questions which maybe, like we have got so many young people who are listening to us, they will answer these questions.
Sure.
But I'm really grateful to you for your comments.
Nice to see you. Nice to hear you again.
Okay. Yes,
so there are few questions from participants, very sure. Pertinent. I would like to club them together because there are many, in fact. So if we go one by one, it will take more time. But yes. Largely the questions are coming up as medical anthropologists, especially for the students who are doing their MPhil PhD post-COVID, what kind of research they can do, what about issues like stigma and distancing, and also about the tribes? I mean, how can we expect them to maintain hygiene or washing hands frequently? So if you can answer a couple of these, then I'll ask set of questions again.
You see, uh, well, first of all, like if you all know that there's a time which was called HIV research period, so everybody, there was so many money was poured in for HIV researches. I think post-corona, there will be a lot of money which will be poured in for epidemic, study of epidemic and virus and related kind of things. Of course, COVID related. Already, I'm told that ICSSR has already floated, proposals for grants for COVID-19. So these are going to be, important. And what medical anthropologists can do is that medical anthropologists can actually try to understand the intricacies of those behaviors which are critical. You know, like a very simple behavior. Why do we touch our face? This is a very simple kind of behavior. But if you go into depth of it and try to understand and then try to suggest how we can take make a behavior change. And now crowding, people try to sit together. If you go to tribal areas, you'll find that people try to gather around a fire. Now how do you maintain a social distance? This is very difficult. Even how do you maintain a social distance when a ritual is going on, when say a shamanistic ritual is going on? In a shamanistic ritual, you have to come very close to each other. How can you maintain social distance? So for the tribal areas particularly, now right now, if you're asking me what is to be, please try to prevent this corona entering tribal areas, because once it enters a tribal areas, it will be very difficult. The social distancing is a luxury, and it is a luxury of the urban areas. It is a luxury of the middle class. It is a luxury of the urban people who are living. It is not possible. It is not possible in villages. It is not possible in tribal areas. So therefore, the best way is that let that coronavirus not enter those areas, because it will be otherwise very, very difficult to contain.
Yes, and there's also a question related to the slums, where again so much of crowding. How do we know such a lockdown? How it has impacted on people who are living in slums, and maybe
Yeah. In urban areas, if you either you relocate them where they can maintain social distance. Now look at Dharavi. What we are seeing in Dharavi, which is coming in the news quite often. It's a very crowded place. It was a place where people were sleeping in shifts. So in a bed, somebody is sleeping in the morning, in the daytime, and someone else will come in the night to sit on the same bed. Now they are all under quarantine. Now these two people having one bed. So in those places, the government has to create, if they want social distancing in slum areas, they'll have to relocate them till some time in separate places where the social distancing. I'm not comfortable with social distancing. I think we should come socially very close. Physical distancing is the right word. That so we should go for physical distancing. We'll have to, after all, it is a disaster situation. So we'll have to. We have got so many, disaster laws can be implemented. We have to relocate them to those buildings, public buildings and other places where the social distancing. In slums, you cannot maintain social distancing. So you are actually relying on your luck that the people who are crowding together do not have a corona positive. That is the only luck that you are trying. Otherwise, there is no way in slum areas you can contain it. Once it enters, it will spread.
there are also a few questions on human behavior, and especially during COVID, how the kind of discrimination we are seeing, how people are being kept at a distance, even burial has become a problem. So how, as an anthropologist, we can understand these issues?
You see, I tell you one thing, this burial thing is a very serious issue. And this has come because people have no knowledge about. They think if you bury somebody, the virus will multiply and start crawling into their homes, which is again a kind of unfounded fear. And another is, if you cremate, the virus will go in air and, and go get into your nose and all those kind of, these are all these are all, scientifically speaking, there is no truth in burial and cremation leading to spread of corona, because corona is a very different kind of virus. So far as we know, of course we don't know much, but so far as we know about corona virus, that it cannot survive for a long time in air. So therefore it is a very unfounded, this has to be, the government has to take action in order to spread awareness about it. They have to spread awareness, hire people who are influential, local leadership. Anthropologists always say that try to go to the local leadership, try to go to the informal channels as well, and try to communicate. Because we have to do two things. We have to reach to people, and we have to also see that these social media things are, rumors are not spreading unnecessarily. So there are two fronts that are there. And these are very serious challenges. In my lecture, I already told, it's a very serious challenge that people are behaving in a very, very awkward way because of ignorance. So therefore, communication is very important. It's very, very important. Effective communication.
Okay, there are two more questions, and then I think I'll ask Sanghmitra to share her views. One question from Soumyajit is, what is the role of anthropology from now to uplift the moral values of marginalized people, as we have seen the suffering?
Well, I think anthropology is not now from, I think from the very beginning. It was siding with the marginalized people. And I think the reason why anthropology is not a very popular subject is because it's not talking of the popular, it's not studying the popular people, it's studying the Dalits, it's studying the tribals, it's studying the poor people. So we have always been siding with them. In my definition that I gave, I think I raised this particular point as well, that it is our duty to empower the marginalized people. So we always have been with them. We always side, to the extent that, sometimes people think that, oh, you work on tribals, you work on poor people. So, we don't work on the film stars, and we don't work on the cricket players. We work on simple people. So that is there. So we have always been there, and we were there, and we are there, we will be there. With poor people, with marginalized people, with people who have no voice, anthropology has always been standing with them.
So another question by Nandakishore, I think that will be useful for all the scholars here, related to methodologies as to how COVID-19 will impact anthropological methodologies. Any suggestions on innovations in methods?
Well, I can give you an example of, Ebola, anthropological researches, where primarily I think two methods, they were very useful. One was participatory methods, and second was qualitative methods. And qualitative methods and these two methods we have tried, and we saw in Ebola researches, they were very, very effective. And I think they would be effective in the initial phases, or in the initial phases of COVID-19 researches. Later on, of course, we can go for larger, other ethnographic methods and all those other methods that we generally use. But in the beginning, I think these two, participatory and qualitative methods, are going to be very, very crucial.
So I suppose the whole idea of starting this kind of series lectures by anthropologists was mainly to understand how anthropology can have a different perspective to look at disasters. And I'm so grateful to Professor Joshi that you have rightly brought in all the perspectives and methods which can help us to understand this disaster much better. I'm sorry for all the participants who have raised many questions, but because of time constraint, we can't take each and every questions individually, but we have clubbed many of them, and I'm sure most of you got your answers. I would like to request Professor Sanghmitra Acharya to give an overview of the lecture, and then thank Professor Joshi.
Thank you, Sunita. I think it was really very informative to listen to Professor Joshi, especially on an issue which is kind of cutting across all sectors of individuals, economies, societies. And Professor Joshi's lecture has knitted all of this very well, especially when he points out to certain things like very simple things like touching the face, how much it is as part of our behavioral aspects that itself can be reflecting on certain aspects of the larger aspect of the disease. The other thing I really feel made a lot of sense for me particularly, when he kind of refrained from using the term social distancing. And I think he very rightly pointed it out, like in our context, the whole idea or whole notion of social distancing has a very different connotation than perhaps it could be for the Western world, where our kind of social distancing doesn't exist. So in our context, I think maybe it's physical distancing, even that perhaps can have certain question marks. Maybe the disease distancing could be a more appropriate term. So I thought he brought in a lot of context very well in the larger backdrop of disconnect that we are trying to draw, how the migrant workers get affected. Fear for sure, but the fear was caused not only by the fear of the disease, but the fear of not being taken care of what the state promised. And especially now when we hear that the migrant laborer is supposed to be transported, is already being transported to their respective places, when we now told that there are 2 more weeks of the lockdown. So if at this time point, if we are deciding to transport them back to their residences, I mean, I have a bit of discomfort on that. What happens after 2 weeks down the timeline? Are they going to be brought back by the same system, or are they going to be left alone over there? And if they're not being brought back, what happens to these places where they've been working? Where will the worker? How will those entities get the workers from? So I think it comes in very neat perspective, the issues which this disease has, or pandemic, if I can use the word, has kind of brought in. And especially, when I would really want to remind us that the caution which WHO gave was way back in January 30th, when we got our first case of COVID in Kerala, when one of the students had traveled back. So from 30th of January till about mid-March, we really didn't do much. I mean, I'm quite emphatic on saying that we only took a decision, to me, which appeared to be in haste towards the end of March, when we locked down the whole country. No other country with far worse conditions did not do that, locking the whole country down. I am sure there will be many of us who might differ on this, but perhaps the idea to lock down was not really thought about. Look at the economy, look at the state of migrant worker. If the worker is being forced to walk down to his place, I think there's something which we need to think about. And I'm really grateful to Professor Joshi that he's brought that so very clearly on board. And a lot of people, I mean 100 plus, I'm sure there would have been more people if we had that scope to listen to and perhaps react to. So I would probably, with these words, look forward to many more interactions with Professor Joshi, and perhaps AIF's subsequent lectures will allow us to raise those further questions. Thank you so much, Professor Joshi. Over to you, Sunita.
So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful lecture, and we all gained with your insights. There were 100 participants and more were joining, but we couldn't take more than 100, so we had to close the meeting room. And I am thanking each and every one for their interest, and we'll be bringing in more and more lectures. And this is the best time to sit in our rooms and understand from our teachers. I suppose best way to get in touch with our colleagues, our friends, and senior professors to know what's happening, and especially because this is a time we are all thinking about the disaster and bringing in our own perspective, understanding. So it would be wonderful for all of us to share our ideas. And I welcome each and every participant for the next coming sessions. Most likely once in a week we'll start off. Next week again we'll meet and we'll share the IDs with the groups which we have already shared today. And I would like to thank each and every participant for a wonderful questions which have come. Many of them have appreciated your lecture, and a few more questions are left, but I'm sure we'll discuss them in the
Yes.
forthcoming seminars. Yes, sir.
I'm really thankful to each and every one of, and there are many of my students who are saying, so really great. It was really great. And I think, and icing on the cake was Siva Prasad and Dr. Sanghmitra Acharya's comments.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Goodbye and take
Goodbye.
care.
Bye
Take
bye.
care. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.